Hello, welcome to Free Bible Commentary with Pastor Teacher Dr. Bob Utley. Be sure to visit Free Bible Commentary at www.freebiblecommentary.org. Now, here's Bob.
Hello, we're going to continue our study in Leviticus. We're going to be in chapter 17 through 20 today. Chapter 17 deals with how do you handle blood, how do you treat blood. Chapter 18 deals with human sexuality. Chapter 19 is how do you relate to a covenant partner, particularly when he sins. And chapter 20 is for those who do sexual sin that are covenant partners and those who sin another way, chapters 19, what are the consequences? What is the punishment for a covenant partner who sins? And that's chapter 20. Now 17, as you know, life is in the blood. That's what 17:11 is all about. Very important distinction. And therefore it had to be treated in a very special way. And that's what this is all about, chapter 17. Now, notice verse 3. Any man from the house of Israel who slaughters an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, who slaughters it outside the camp, and is not brought to the door of the tent of meeting, this is obviously the wilderness wandering experience. It fits the historicity of the mobile camp. But Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 23 and following, has to adapt this to a settled land of Canaan setting, because everybody can't come to the tabernacle to kill an animal once they're in the land. It'd be too far away. But they can while they're in the wilderness wandering, because the tabernacle is with all the people. They're camped around it. So it's a way of showing, it's a way of providing food for the priest and a way of showing the sacredness of life to God. This idea of blood guiltiness mentioned in verse 4. Blood guiltiness is something that polluted the whole land. Even animal blood could pollute the land if not treated right. I guess it's another way of speaking of the holiness of life, whether it be animal life or human life. Number 7 is this strange little deal about no one shall no longer sacrifice to goat demons, which they play the harlot. Now, of course, playing the harlot means usually going after other gods, but it could be something be involved with the fertility worship here. It's possible. We're not sure about this goat demon. Many relate it to Azazel in the previous chapter of the Day of Atonement. I'm just not sure. But it does show this is dealing with covenant partners, and it shows that even in the community of faith there were those who were going after foreign gods and idolatry. Goat demons were sometimes seen like Pan in the Greek pantheon, or kind of had a sexual orientation to them. It almost sometimes speaks of bestiality, which we'll deal with in chapter 18. Notice in verse 8 it mentions the alien who sojourns among you. Now the alien had some rights and responsibilities. Matter of fact, as you learn down here in verse 12, Israel was to control other parts of the population, whether it be a slave in their home or an alien resident. Now, they had to legislate how they acted too. So here's a good example of those who follow Yahweh did pass laws to regulate the rest of the populations. Now these aliens mentioned in verse 8, they had to keep the Sabbath, Exodus 20 verse 10. They had to observe the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16:29. They could not practice idolatry, Leviticus 20 verse 2. They could not blaspheme, Leviticus 24:16. So they were a limited part of the covenant because their acts could also symbolically pollute the land. Notice in verse 10 it mentions anyone who would eat blood. You say, yuck, who would eat blood? You might go back to Genesis 9:4 is the place this whole idea of eating blood, the first use of blood there, crying from the ground, kind of goes back to that. You might want to see verse 11. This is very important. This is one of those key verses you ought to mark in your Bible. For the life of the flesh in its blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood by reason of life that makes atonement. When God said to Adam, the soul that sins, it will surely die, He meant what He said. But in His great mercy, He allowed in this old covenant that the blood of innocent animals that represented sinlessness took the place of the sin of man. Oh, there's coming a day where the sinless Lamb of God will fulfill this completely. Let's see. Let me skip down. Notice in verses 14, 15, and 16 is what about an animal that's found dead? Or what about an animal you kill when you're out hunting? You obviously can't rope a wild animal and bring it to the tabernacle door to kill it. You could kill it there, but you had to treat the blood appropriately. There was a respect even for hunting practices or an animal found dead. And that's what these last few verses are about. Now, in verse 18, we have the laws regarding human sexuality. You might want to see Exodus 20, verse 14. Maybe a development of this. I'm just not sure. Now, there is a similar pattern here in verse 18 to what we call the Hittite suzerain treaties. Deuteronomy seems to be based on this pattern. Joshua 24 seems to be based on this pattern. And what it is, we feel like it's a way of proving the historicity of this Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Joshua to that extent of the 2nd millennium BC, because it seems to do a pattern that we have found in the Hittite treaties in central Turkey. And I think that gives a good historicity here. Possibly these sexual abuses are, number one, abuses the Hebrews knew about from both Egyptian sexual improprieties and Canaanite sexual improprieties. So Israel was to be different than her pagan neighbors, both in what they eat and how they live and how they express their human sexuality. Others say they're given for the sexual happiness of the individual and the stability of the community. And I think that's true. I think all three of those has a place here. And so notice again, God speaks to Moses, and he's to say to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord your God. Now that sets the stage for our sexuality. Who he is reflects who we are, even in our expression of our maleness and femaleness. Look at verse 3. You shall not do, number 1, what was done in the land of Egypt. Or number 2, what was done in the land of Canaan. And there we see exactly this is to be different. As their food laws were different, so are their sexual practices to be different. Notice the end of verse 5. So you shall keep my statutes, my judgments, by which a man may live if he does them. I am the Lord. The Old Testament does teach if you keep all the law from birth to death, you can be right with God. But the problem is that no one's ever been right, never been able to do that. That's why the book of Galatians can say if you break one law one time, the way of self-effort to approach God is closed. Now, notice if you would where it says, and none of you shall approach any blood relative. Now what follows is a discussion of what is a blood relative. Of course, these are laws that deal with incense. And when it says to uncover their nakedness, that's basically a euphemism or a metaphor for sexual intercourse. Now, how are they going to define incest? Well, verse 7, it's your mother. And then in verse 8, it's your father's wife, like a stepmother or a second wife. And then in verse 9, it's your sister, your father's daughter or your mother's daughter. Any member of the extended family. It's a sister you can't know. Your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter. No, not second generation either. Verse 11, your father's wife's daughter. No. Your father's sister, your mother's sister, your father's brother, his wife, your daughter-in-law, your brother's wife, a woman and her daughter at the same time, her son's daughter and her daughter's daughter. You shall not marry a woman in addition to her sister as a rival while she is alive. Now, I must admit to you, there are parts of Genesis where the patriarchs break this. Abraham did marry his half-sister. Jacob did marry two sisters. But that seems to be in an earlier time when this was not as spelled out. Isn't it unusual that a sister is not mentioned here? Excuse me, a daughter. But that may have been so obvious that no one even brought it up, right? So here we have the laws of incest and how they are to be handled. I was thinking that the exception to this, of course, is Levirate marriage, Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10, where a brother could take his dead brother's wife to raise up a son. And, of course, that was done for inheritance rights. Look at verse 19. You shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness during her menstrual impurity. Now, this probably goes back to Leviticus 15, 19 through 24, Leviticus 20, 18. Now, why? The Jews believed that any kind of bodily emissions made them unclean, whether the natural birthing process the sexual act, any kind of bleeding sore, any kind of disease. And this does not mean that there's something sinful about this. It's ceremonial purity that's involved. Notice again where it says in verse 20, you shall not have intercourse with your neighbor's wife to defile her. And there again, there has to be a distinction. This is probably related to the Canaanite fertility cult where everybody made love to everybody. No, that is to be inappropriate. Notice verse 21, you shall not give your offspring to offer to Molech. And the word here is pass through. Now Molech is a fire god. He's going to be discussed here in verse 18 and then later again in this same section, verse 20, verse 2. We think it's a Phoenician fire god that was worshipped by sacrificing your firstborn child to. And the Jews just hated this god. They participated in this at times in their history. It was done outside Jerusalem later on, and they turned the place into a garbage dump. And this is where when Jesus uses the word Gehenna, that's the place where Molech was worshipped. It became his metaphor for hell that the Jews turned into the city garbage dump. You might want to see Jeremiah 32:35 where this is mentioned, and Ezekiel 16:20. Molech. It's a corruption of the Hebrew word melech, or king. It's the consonants for melech, king, and the vowels for boshim, shame. Molech. You might want to see 19:2-5 also. Notice 22, you shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. And of course this is a reference to homosexuality. And how do we beat around the bush? I think God loves homosexuals, but homosexuality is an inappropriate lifestyle for the people of God. You might want to see where it possibly allusion to in Genesis 19:5 and following, Sodom and Gomorrah. Leviticus 20 verse 13 is another allusion to homosexuality. Judges 19:22 and following, that's another example of homosexuals in a city later on. Romans 1:27 and 1 Corinthians 6:9 are all references, I think, to homosexuality. And again, it's an inappropriate sexual activity for the people of God. Notice it says you shall not have intercourse with an animal. This deals with bestiality. I think you've got to realize here that it's the mixing of the orders. The same way angels can't take humans, humans can't take animals. Again, we know it's part of the Canaanite sexual ritual to have intercourse with animals. That shall not be for the people of God. It shall not be. Nor shall a woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It's the mixing of the orders of creation. You might want to see 19:19, where things should not be mixed. By the way, between verse 23 and 24, probably chapter 19, verse 20 adds another sexual note there, and you might want to compare 19 verse 20 and 19:29 is another sexual restriction that probably should be here in our logical presentation of the Western world. Do not defile yourself with any of these, for by these the nations which I am casting out before you have become defiled. Now we learn from Genesis 15:16 that the Amorites, which is a collective term for all the Canaanite tribes, was kicked out of the promised land because of their sin. And what God's telling Israel is, I'm no respecter of persons. If you do what they do, I'll kick you out of the land too. And he did. And he did. It's, okay, let's see. For the land has become defiled. See, this ceremonial uncleanliness of the sexual wickedness affects the land. It's going to say the land is going to vomit them out. Wow. And notice it refers to neither the native, the alien who sojourns with you. Israel was allowed to legislate the sexual activity of other members of her society, even if they weren't part of the covenant people. I think we ought to hear that in our day. I think Christians ought to be involved in making laws. I think we ought to stop abortion if we possibly can. Notice the number of times through here it says it is an abomination, these kinds of things, and they are to be shunned. So there is an appropriate. Our sex is good and wholesome. It's from God. It's God's idea. It's His will for man. But there is some bounds on it. And this is the negative bounds as marriage is the positive bounds. Now, in chapter 19, we have how do you relate to your covenant partner if he sins? What are the sins that would cause the community to disintegrate? Well, let's look at this. Speak to all the congregation, the sons of Israel, and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. There ought to be a quality of our life that reflects that we're the people of God. This little phrase, for I am holy, appears over and over in this book of Leviticus. 11 verses 44 and 45, chapter 20 verse 7 and 26. We are to take on the family characteristics of God, right? And holy, of course, means set apart for a particular task. Everyone shall revere his mother and his father. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's very much like the 10 laws of Exodus 20, verse 12. There was a respect due the family. Societies that have a family respect and a family stability and a family strength are societies that last. That's the implication here. Notice mother is mentioned first, which is unusual and shows the appropriateness of a respect for both the father and the mother. Do not turn to idols. Again, Exodus 20, verses 4 through 6. Many see that chapter 19 reflects the 10 Commandments, but in a slightly different form. And here, of course, is the ideal of idols. We're to flee from them because we only worship one God. That's the implication. Now, when you offer a sacrifice of peace, a peace offering was discussed earlier in Leviticus 1 through 7. It was a fellowship offering to the Lord. You shall take it that it may be accepted, and you shall eat the same day you offer it, and the next day, what remains on the third day shall be burnt with fire. There was 2 days for fellowship. Is it hygienic purposes that says not the third? Well, some would say that. Others would say it was to promote people to invite their other covenant partners to come to the fellowship meal because they couldn't eat all the meat themselves even in 2 days. So it was encouraged to invite the poor, to invite the Levites, to invite their neighbors, to have a community fellowship with these meats because the Israelites didn't eat much meat. And whoever eats it will bear his iniquity, for he profaned a holy thing of the Lord. It was sacrificed to the Lord. It was part of it became a holy thing, had to be eaten appropriately. That person shall be cut off. Now, some say it means excommunicated out of the covenant community. But to tell you the truth, this word most of the time means to be put to death. And I think that it is probably the death penalty here for eating on the third day that which is holy. And you shall not reap the harvest of your land. You shall not reap every corner of your field. Neither shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. Look at verse 10. Deals with vineyards. Now, what is this? This goes back to Deuteronomy 24, 19 through 22. We see it expressed in the book of Ruth. When they reaped their field, they didn't go right to the corners, and they didn't pick up every piece of grain in the field. They didn't pick every piece of fruit off the tree. Why? For the poor, the alien, the widow to have some food. Again, it's God's provision for the poor. In verse 9, you shall not steal, nor shall you deal faulty. Again, Exodus chapter 20, verse 15, and Exodus chapter 20, verse 16, about not stealing and not bearing false witness here. You shall not swear falsely by my name so as to profane the name of the Lord your God. This is taking an oath in court, or an oath like, oh, that's a good car. I just swear to God that's a good car. Oh, friend, we don't bring God's name into business deals. And if we don't swear, that's what Exodus 20, verse 12, you do not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain is. You shall not oppress your neighbor, nor rob him, nor the wages of a hired man are meant to remain to him all night until morning. As you know, people worked all day to feed their family at night. To hold back the man's pay at night to ensure he came back to work the next day was illegal. They were to pay the man that night. And we see this in the New Testament as Jesus talked about it. You shall not curse a deaf man nor place a stumbling block before the blind. Now here is certain actions towards people who are handicapped. We're to treat the handicapped with respect. We're not to make fun of them. We're not to. It shows something against their Creator that we make fun of them. And so it shows here we're not to do that. You might want to see Matthew 25:45. Whenever we help those